Let's go back to one of our top stories now, where clergy leaders in East London have expressed disappointment in the court's decision not to deport controversial Nigerian televangelist Timothy Omotoso. He will not be deported until his application for the High Court to review a decision by the Home Affairs Minister declaring him a prohibited person is heard. University of Johannesburg's Professor Maria Frahm-Arp joins us now for more reaction on this. A very good afternoon to you, Prof. Thank you very much for your time. As you can see on our screen, if you can, the congregation of Timothy Omotoso very overjoyed and thanking their God for once again being on his side.
Yes, they're extraordinary scenes, and good afternoon to you and all the viewers. These are scenes that are quite similar to the sorts of scenes that we saw after the Cheryl Zondi trial, which never really was concluded. And again, people felt that that was a moment where God intervened. And then, of course, in the latest trials that we've seen this year, people feel God has intervened. And of course, this all speaks to the prophet's message that he is a man of God, especially elected by God, with special powers and special privileges and special protection from God. And if people follow him, then they will enjoy the same benefits and privileges.
It's difficult to argue with people who believe in that way, isn't it?
It is, and one of the reasons that it's so difficult to argue with them is because this form of Christianity that we are seeing is even more selective of the biblical passages that it engages with than any other form of Christianity we've seen. And what happens is these prophets pull on very selected passages of scripture, and then they use this to build a particular rhetoric of the fact that people don't need to live according to the rules of the day. For example, we saw a lot of children outside of the courtroom. Because actually understanding God is more important than going to school. And they also say that, God is going to bless those who give to God. And yes, there is a passage in scripture that says, blessed are those who give. But there are also other passages that talk about the importance of living in your reality, whatever that might be. And even blessed are the poor. But these passages are never referred to. And this is one of the things that makes it so difficult to argue with these people. These prophets also write lots of different books and then have very long church services many times a week. So people that become part of churches like this sort of become sucked into a whole world view that may appear incredibly rational because it's never challenged by anyone, and because it is so all-pervasive of every aspect of your life, how you vote, how you spend your money, whom you have relationships with, how you bring up your children. It becomes this all-encompassing discourse. And people, begin to live in this reality and don't engage with other viewpoints.
A lot of proponents and apologists of apartheid, for example, engaged in similar ways of reading and interpreting the scriptures. They use the Bible very effectively as part of oppressing the majority in this country. It is thanks, of course, to other Christians, like the people who preached liberation or black theology, but also other people, including people from the conservative Dutch Reformed Church, to, of course, undo that as well. But what I'm saying is this is not something completely new. It may be taking a different dimension or whatever, but it's not entirely new.
No, it's not new. It's not a new phenomenon in South Africa, and it's not a new phenomenon in the history of the church. Many churches have done this throughout the ages. When the Bible was first put together, it took nearly 400 years to put the Bible together because people had such vehement debates about what should actually be included.
And I was looking earlier, you may have seen a clip we've been playing, Pastor Bulelani Khalezwin saying, talking about how the country's prosecution system continues to fail South Africa, which, as a matter of fact, is actually true, because if you listen to what the judge had to say on the back of how that case of your Cheryl Zondi's was botched, you have to agree. But then there's something that at a personal level sits a bit uncomfortably with me when a pastor is the one who has, I'm not saying they're wrong and they shouldn't, raises the kinds of issues that they raise, because part of me says, what if they are, for lack of a better word, jealous of the fact that the types of pastors like us, Omotoso, have come through and have taken away a lot of people with them, and leaving a lot of churches to bleed in a way.
So that is true to an extent, but you've also got to remember that there are churches in South Africa that have become big international churches and are attracting people from other parts of Africa as well. And one of them, Rabboni, is attracting people from all over the world. So this is a contested international space where pastors are vying not just for followers in one country, but for followers in the international space. Another thing with many of these churches is that a lot of them have become very successful at being either completely online post-COVID or a sort of hybrid where on their TV channels and their Facebook channels, their services are streamed, and many of their followers do not actually come from the country where these pastors are based. So one of the realities is that if Omotoso were to leave South Africa, his following may not decrease significantly, because his machine with its TV channels and its social media, etc., will continue to function. And many of his followers do not actually physically go to his church, but they follow it on online platforms.
Now, how do we then cut through the noise as well as the emotions to really begin to interrogate these matters soberly, calmly, but hopefully with a recognizable end to some of the practices that are really wrong that we have seen. And I know that CRL Rights Commission has been grappling with this, and there's been a lot of emotions, but also condensation whenever these matters have been raised. But from where you sit, Prof, what are some of the things we haven't been able to do up until now to really sensitize people to some of these issues, but without necessarily venturing into areas where we disallow effectively people from actually practicing their religion, as long as it's not harmful in any way?
Yeah. So this is a very, very tricky question, and it's one that has been, so to speak, been keeping me awake at night for over 20 years, and many of my colleagues that work in this area. The difficult thing is that you, of course, can't paint all churches with the same brush. Some churches do an enormous amount of good. So that, of course, is the first thing that is difficult. But let's look at churches where it appears as though much abuse is taking place in these churches. The first thing is that we are seeing phenomenon like this all over the world, all over Africa, Latin America, North America, Korea, China, Europe, everywhere. So that's one of the things that makes this so difficult. So how then do we respond? I think the response needs to come from a number of different quarters. The first response, I think, should be coming from the broader Christian community, where as Christians, we are able to clearly state what it is we believe in and why. Perhaps reminders of the broader scope of the Bible, some of the nuanced understandings within this rather complex text. I also think that we need to work together with leaders of African religious groups, varying traditions, because what a lot of these prophets are doing is they are merging forms of Christianity and certain practices, particularly from African traditional religious practices, and sort of creating something new for the moment. And I think that if traditional healers and leaders could be speaking into the space as well, talking about what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. The third part of the argument that, of course, becomes very tricky is how we have so many different messages all over our social media, and we have so much disinformation and fake news. And that, of course, makes it very difficult to put a message out there to try and explain what is a good way to live. Because the followers of these many different prophets believe that the message of these prophets is the right thing. And then this brings us to the fourth level, and that is that, across the world, we live in such uncertain times. With people like President Trump, the global stage seems to change on a weekly basis. And it's really ordinary people who lose their jobs, who get affected by inflation, and who become despondent. And these churches are offering a higher power to those in positions of political power or economic power. And so these prophets are seen for their followers as these extraordinary men who have this extraordinary power that is given to them by God. So they have access to a higher power than any political or economic power. And if you, as a follower, do what these prophets say, then you too have access to this power. And in a world that is so uncertain, this kind of message becomes particularly attractive to people. So unfortunately, I think that the more uncertainty we see on the global stage, the more attractive prophets like this will become for people locally. And I don't just mean in South Africa, I mean locally across the world, in all our different countries.
We have run out of time, but I have to ask you this, especially on the back of everything you've just said. Much as, I mean, more than 80% of South Africans are Christians. It's not the entire population. And not only that, but we are, or at least in the book, we remain a secular state. How does that measure up with everything what you've just said?
Yeah, so we are a secular state in our constitution, and then a highly religious community of people. And the two things are quite different. And for much of our democracy, the two things have been very different. But in articles that I've just written, what we are beginning to see is a bleeding in of religious power and religious voices into the political. So that as we have big groups of people belonging to certain churches, and these churches encourage people to vote in a particular way, so the divide between politics and religion becomes much closer. What then starts to happen is, in order to keep your votes, what concessions might political leaders give to religious leaders as they draw more and more followers from particular religious constituents, i.e. big mega churches.
Prof, let's leave it there for this afternoon. Thank you very much for your time and insights. Professor Maria Frahm-Arp of the University of Johannesburg's Christian Studies in Africa.